My name is Jen Krim, and I'm originally from Kentucky, but have lived in Washington, D.C. for years. I also lived in the Arabian Gulf, and have worked in the U.S. government, and am now in Tunisia and traveling writing a book about the Arab Spring. Before I came here, I had actually studied the Middle East and North Africa for a long time, because when I was younger, this was the most foreign place I could think of. But the first time I came, I was surprised not by how foreign it was, but actually by how familiar it was. I'm from a place called Kentucky in what I consider to be the American South, and it's very socially conservative and very Christian. In my town, there was actually no alcohol until just a few years ago. There's a focus on saving yourself until marriage, very hospitable and generous, and a small town atmosphere. And in the Gulf, I felt it was very similar. It was the same way. People were open and generous and focused on family values, and it was socially conservative and friendly. One thing I did not expect to find in the Middle East, North Africa, were the very interesting stereotypes about Americans, especially about American women. And some of the more extreme examples that I've heard, I met a Qatari woman who, when we became friends, she started asking me these burning questions she had about American women. She asked if there were American women over age, I think she said 13, if they were virgins. If there were any virgins over the age of 13, if every American woman had to have a paternity test to figure out who the father of her child was, if every American woman slept with each of her male friends. And a lot of these stereotypes came from American media. She had seen shows like Jerry Springer, talk shows like Jerry Springer. She had seen American movies, a popular plot line where women fall in love with their friends and get married. And another stereotype that I was surprised at was that the U.S. was very dangerous. I met a young a young Kuwaiti teenager who wanted to study in the U.S., but her parents wouldn't let her because they'd seen so many American movies that were violent, and they believed when she came to the U.S. she'd be raped, killed by gang violence, killed by a serial killer, and they wouldn't let her come to the U.S. There are actually two things I expected to find, which I was very happy that they were true. One was the food, which I love, from Khaliji biryani to Tunisian couscous and harissa mshwiya. But in all seriousness, I expected to find people who were the same as in the US, kind and generous and open, and very willing to talk about where they're from and what they believe, and to share. People who understand that there's a big divide between the US and this part of the world, and are eager to kind of set the record straight. Well, I think there are a lot of stereotypes about this region that are really unfortunate. One of the most disturbing stereotypes is that this region is very dangerous. In fact, a lot of my friends and family said their final goodbyes to me when I move here, because they believe that as a blonde American, I'll be targeted and killed by terrorists. And they haven't seen the Middle East that I see, which is full of generous and kind people. They believe that, especially because of 9/11, they think that the region is very violent, and they don't see the kind and generous people. They don't see the culture, the religion as being peaceful. I think there are a lot of stereotypes about that, and there are also funny stereotypes. I think people have actually asked me if, as a woman, I can drive a car, and they ask me if I ride camels while I'm here. I think that there are a lot of negative stereotypes perpetuated by the American media. I think that the American media shares a lot of stories that are inflammatory about this region, stories that come from Saudi Arabia, that come from Iran, that come from Afghanistan. Iran and Afghanistan are not actually Arab, obviously. But I think many American women get the feeling, and what they see in the media is that Arab women are forced to cover, that they're not allowed to drive, that many are oppressed, that they are not educated, or they're not allowed to participate in society. And I think the stereotype, number one, is very, very, very wrong and very unfortunate. I think Arab women are often portrayed as victims, when in fact the women that I've met in the various different countries I've been to are some of the bravest, strongest people I've ever met, and they fight constantly. But also the question of hijab, I think, is very interesting. A lot of Americans ask me if, when I come to this region, I have to cover my hair, if I have to cover my body, and if I have to cover my face. And I think many Americans get the view from the media that the images in Yemen are the same as the images in Tunisia. But they may not realize that in Tunisia, there are some Tunisian women who are also Arab and Muslim who wear miniskirts and stilettos. I think there's a difference in culture between the different countries that doesn't come across in the media, and that a lot of Americans don't understand. And the hijab is also very interesting because many Americans forget that some Christians cover their hair. And in recent history, my mother, for example, grew up in the Catholic Church, and she was raised to cover her hair whenever she went into church. And it's something that I think a lot of Americans forget. And I think that it's very important to not take American culture and lay it on top of the culture in the Middle East, North Africa, but to try and see the culture through the eyes of the people who actually live here, and to see that the cultures in each country are different. So in the US, I'm sure many American women would say that their culture, they would not feel comfortable going to the post office in a bikini. And some women in Yemen, for example, would feel more comfortable wearing a different dress than people in Tunisia, than people in the US, than people in France. I think that the American media doesn't do it on purpose, but I do believe that yes, the message that many Americans receive is that the Middle East, North Africa is how the media portrays Saudi Arabia, how the media portrays Yemen or Afghanistan. I don't think the media does a very good job of sharing the differences between each country, that a woman in Afghanistan who wears burqa, in Tunisia, the women sometimes wear miniskirts and stilettos, and I don't think that the differences between the different countries actually comes through. And I think that's a real shame. And maybe not out of ignorance, but I think the stories that the US media shares with Americans, they're stories that Americans would find interesting or fascinating or surprising. And I think that the stories that are inflammatory are stories that people remember, and I think that's part of it. But I also think that people in the US don't understand this region, and I think that people tend to fear what they don't understand. And I think also that that's another reason why in the US media, TV, movies, news, people in this region are often portrayed as villains. They're not portrayed as how they should be, as they actually are. And I think that's a shame. I believe that new media can make a big difference. I think that new media helped unite people across class lines, across sectarian lines, through the Arab Spring. And I think that that newfound solidarity can also be used to connect people across the cultural divide, to connect people from the Middle East, North Africa, to people in the US. Because I think right now the current system isn't working. The current system of statistics and dense news articles and NGOs and government programs, I think it's not working. I think that the human brain is wired to put more emphasis on emotion than reason. Humans like to think of themselves as reasonable creatures, but honestly, the human brain, when you're making a decision, it puts more weight on emotion than reason. So statistics can only go so far. I think that the way people have to connect is emotionally and through a personal connection. And I think that the news media, the dense news articles, the think tanks, academics, and government programs, it's not helping bridge the cultural gap. And that's actually why I'm here. I'm doing a book about the Arab Spring, and what I'm trying to do is help people in the US connect to women here who went through the revolutions, and to make a personal, emotional connection, so that a woman in Kansas who lost her son in the Iraq War could connect to a Syrian woman who lost her son in the current conflict, so that a rural woman in Alabama can connect to a rural woman in Yemen and see that, you know, there are a lot of things that unite us. There are more things that unite us than divide us. So I have one superficial example of how things in the U.S. are actually very similar to experiences in the Gulf that I have. I remember a lot of get-togethers and barbecues in the U.S. where people are standing around talking about politics and sports and religion, and they're drinking tea and lemonade and talking about their families and catching up with each other. And the Bible will usually come out and people talk about religion. And in the Gulf, it was the same way. The differences were that the lemonade had mint in it, the tea was hot, not iced, and instead of a pig on a spit, there was a lamb. But I also want to point out that a lot of the religious figures that people talked about at the barbecues are the same. That Muslims believe in Jesus, Isa. They believe in Mary, Maryam. They believe in Abraham, Ibrahim, Isaac, Isaac. They're the same figures, and I think it's amazing that we focus so much on what divides us instead of what unites us.
Thank you.
Okay. It's crazy. I think a lot of the stereotypes in both of the regions are the same. I think Americans think that Arabs are uneducated, and Arabs think Americans are uneducated. Americans think that Arabs are violent and terrorists, and Arabs think that Americans are violent and want to kill Arabs with Palestine and the Iraq War. Americans think that Arab women are oppressed because of news and video coming out of Saudi Arabia, and I think some Arab women actually believe that American women are oppressed or judged by their appearance and aren't free. And it's just really interesting to see that a lot of the same stereotypes exist on both sides. I think the media is a huge problem, and I think it's a huge problem on both sides. And I think part of that is profit as well. I think people are drawn to media that is sensationalist, and the media over the years has gotten more and more sensationalist. And I think that's the problem. They keep looking for stories that are more and more exciting or different or surprising. And I think that helps make the divide even bigger, because they hear about the stories that are inflammatory or shocking out of Saudi Arabia, Iran, or Afghanistan, not paying attention to some of the good human stories that are coming out of other countries, or even in the same countries, because they don't drive the same profit margin. Politics is a major problem, and I think there's a foreign policy crisis, honestly, in the U.S., because I think there's so many misunderstandings in the U.S. about this part of the world, and the people who don't understand this part of the world vote for members of Congress, and those members of Congress are making decisions that affect the world. What American foreign policy affects almost every country in the world, and I think it's very sad that a lot of Americans have these negative stereotypes about the Arab world. It's very unfortunate, and it's very counterproductive. And if the U.S. wants good relations with this part of the world, Americans, average Americans, not just people who work in think tanks, not just people who work in government or in NGOs, average Americans need to have a better understanding of this part of the world, because it's so important that these two regions understand each other and don't have these horrible, completely off-base misconceptions about each other, going both ways, from Qatari women asking me if there are any virgins over the age of 13 and if every American has to have a paternity test to figure out who the father of her child is, to my family in the US who actually asked me to dye my hair dark because they thought I was going to be targeted and killed by terrorists because I'm a blonde American. But I think the real problem is people need to realize and to connect and to know that people are the same everywhere. People are human. People are generous and kind and curious. And more often than not, people are very open-minded and willing to hear another opinion and willing to open their mind and change their opinions about a group of people if they're challenged. People are curious and kind and generous. My family was not conservative. I came from a very conservative place, a state called Kentucky in the American South, where It's very Christian, very socially conservative. My town actually did not have alcohol until just a few years ago. And there's a very big focus on family values, on saving yourself until marriage, on Southern hospitality, and on helping your neighbor. And that was something that really reminded me of home when I was in Kuwait. I felt those same values were in Kuwait and in Qatar and in the UAE when I was there, and they reminded me of home.